All right, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started for this afternoon. I'm going to add to your cohort channel. I'm going to drop the link to, oh, for some reason, it's not a link. Oh, no, I think it worked. I dropped the link to my notes that I'm going to take for this class into your cohort channel. I also put it in the calendar event link there as well. And so I've got one question for you all for this first discussion we're going to do. So what is the difference between a failure and an error? I'm going to give you all about 5 minutes to discuss in your breakout rooms. What's the difference between a failure and an error? All right, breakout room should be open. All right, welcome back, everybody. So I want to take some, I'm going to call on some people randomly to hear some thoughts. But before I do this, I just want to like kind of ground this conversation in this idea that what we're going to be talking about today in terms of SADPATs and flashes is going to be, we're going to extend on top of what you all did in the morning session. So that's kind of what we're starting off here with, like thinking maybe using some of what we talked about this morning as an example. We're going to start to like apply those concepts. So let's hear some thoughts on this. What's the difference between a failure and an error? Jenny.
Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Mm-hmm.
An error could be like something in your code is actually wrong, or something in your test is wrong. A failure could be like even talking about today with our data validations. If the user typed in something, the code is still going to execute, but it would fail because of the information getting sent in.
So maybe you said, but it could fail. What would I write here? But something fails.
The test.
The test, maybe.
Saving the day. I don't know.
I think this is great. The test fails is definitely right. It's not like the whole story, but I think this is a great start, Jenny. Let's hear from a couple other folks. Let's go to Alexa.
Basically, I think our general understanding, what we talked about, is an error is when your code doesn't act how you expect. And a failure, your code is working, but it's not working the way it should because you're not passing your test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm actually going to move this down under the failure category here. So doesn't act how we expect. So I think, let me actually do this. So doesn't act how we expect. I'm going to say the app doesn't act how we expect. And under that, I would say there's like two ways it could not act how we expect. One, the test fails. If the test fails, that's telling us one of our expectations aren't met. Let's hear from Genevieve.
So I think another thing to add to that is that like our interaction with the data fails, whether we're like updating, inserting, or maybe deleting an object.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this could be like a create, an update, a destroy, something along those lines. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Awesome. And I'm going to generalize this one a little bit more. So this is like our interaction with the data fails, or it could be just like our interaction with the app doesn't do what we expect. So kind of what I'm getting at here is that when we're talking about the app doesn't work, the app doesn't act how we expect, well, there's two ways that we could know that. One, our automated test system, and two, someone actually like interacting with the app. And I think that these last two bullet points are examples of that. It could be like the database, like we try to do something in the database, but maybe it's something as simple as like, something like we see a broken link, or we click a link and it's broken. Something like that. So just to point out that it doesn't necessarily have to be in the database. It could be like, oh, this link isn't broken. Or maybe you go to a site and rather than a background image, you see like a image can't be found, something like that. Cool, thank you to my random volunteers. Does anybody have anything else they would like to add to this? Maybe maybe another question to answer here is like something like what happens. So Ben, I'll take your comments next. And then this is another question for you all to think of. What happens when we get an error and what happens when we get a failure? And Ben, I'll let you go next.
Just kind of going off of what happens in the error side. I think it also depends, unless the way I'm thinking about it is different in Ruby and how they build their stuff. But I think that there are different like types of errors, whether it's like on the syntax side versus like the compiler side. And so it could just be like you're not giving the correct amount of arguments, in which case it's like we couldn't execute the thing that you're telling us because we didn't, or something else broke before we could do it.
So say Ruby couldn't execute the thing we wanted. There are different types of errors right here. One thing that I want to point out, you mentioned this like briefly, but different languages will handle errors differently. And something else that you mentioned is like compile time errors. This is like definitely nice to know territory right here. But just in case you're interested, Ruby is not compiled. So there are no compile time errors in Ruby. Versus like another compiled language, like if you're working in Java or you're working in C, and there's a million compiled and not compiled languages, but Ruby is not compiled. So we're not going to get compilation time errors. So that means with Ruby, actually, I'll just say runtime errors. So this is what Ruby can't execute the thing we wanted to. It gets to a line of code, we tell it to do something, and it doesn't work. That's what I would say is a runtime error. So other languages also have runtime errors. That's common to all languages. Compile time errors, not something you're going to find in all languages. Let's keep going with any comments, or let's fill out this like what happens. So like Ruby couldn't execute the thing we wanted. So like what happens to our application? What happens to our what happens to our application? We've got a Rails app running in Heroku. Our code experiences some error. What would the user see? Can I get a volunteer? Kwa?
I'm just gonna wing it here. Would it be like some type of a method error or like
So
an
that's
action error, right?
That's a potential of like something we might see. So we could get like no method error. We could get like wrong. I think it's actually like argument error. I'm typing these out in camel cases because these are classes within Ruby. It's not super important for us to like understand that right now, but our errors can be represented as Ruby objects themselves. So I would say, Qua, those are types of errors that we could potentially get. But what would the user experience be if we did that, or if we got one of those? Let's go to Joseph.
Yeah, I think you can choose what the user sees as far as the error goes. Like something something I did in the project was display the errors full messages. So it's like it just gives an actual like it gives the actual message, it renders it. So it's like you left name blank or whatever.
Yeah, so I would say that's an example of handling the error. And when you handle the error, you are actually, I would say you're no longer into this error territory. And that's kind of what I want to make the distinction. So Joseph, when you say like, I want to give the user some like feedback or like tell them that they did something wrong, now we're more in that failure territory. So it's very important to distinguish the two. So if we don't handle the error, what's going to happen in terms of like the user's experience? Jake?
They get like a 404.
Yeah, and I would say that that's like another example of an error they could get. It could be a 404, it could be a 503, et cetera. But those are all examples of like what's happening to the application at that point.
Would it then just like display nothing?
Not quite, it still displays the error. Does anybody know what I'm getting at? Doug?
The application stops running.
Yeah,
It just hard brakes on the program.
yeah, the application breaks. So it stops running. There's no way to move forward for the user. I'll say for the user. So like an error message pops up. So like Jake said, like a 404 pops up or whatever, a 500 pops up and the user sees that. Well, when they just get an error, we always have to assume that the people using our applications for the most part, I mean, it does depend on your audience, but for the most part, we're developing applications not for other developers to use. We're developing applications for regular people on the internet. So if we display like 404, blah, 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 this can't be done, they're not going to, what are they going to do? A user is not going to say, oh, well, let me go try to figure out this error. They're going to go use a different application. So if at any point your app just breaks and stops working, a user isn't going to say, well, let me try and like figure out what's going on here. They're going to say, there's a million apps out there that work. Let me just go find one that does. So users in general are like pretty impatient. They expect things like lightning fast. And so we want to design our apps to kind of like appease them, to give the user what they want. That's really our job. So this is the key point here. When your app produces an error, nothing can continue. That's kind of like assuming that we don't handle the error. And I showed you all how to do a little bit of that with in the class methods class, I showed you like a begin rescue block. But assuming that we don't do that, our app is just going to break. Nothing is happening. Versus what happens if we get a failure? Katie?
So maybe the app will still work, but the intended behavior is just not what we expected for the user.
Exactly. Thank you, Katie. So when we're talking about this issue of errors and failures, we want to be more into this failure side of things, where things aren't going to work as expected. Let me see if I can do a quick how developers see users. Yeah. So this is, as a developer, how you can expect a user to use your application. Users are always going to do something wrong. They're gonna, you say like, oh, here's this like nice, easy drinking glass. How hard could this be? And they will find some way to mess it up. They will find some way to do things incorrectly. So this is kind of the point of this class here, that when things fail, that's better than them erroring out. And as we saw with our code, with our validations earlier, there are certain things that will produce errors, and there are certain things that won't produce errors. And so we want to tend more towards the things that are not going to produce errors and handle them gracefully. So I'd say what down here for what happens, what we want is it to be handled gracefully. So let's start a new section of notes down here, and let's talk about SAD paths. And now we're like kind of getting into the content of class today. But so for SAD paths, we know users are going to mess things up. This is kind of the like, we just have to accept this. There's no way to get around it. We don't want errors in our application. So really, there's no part of our application where an error is acceptable. And if an error is produced, we want to handle it. And that's where those begin rescue blocks come in. And I'll just make a note here. This is nice to know, not need to know. That begin rescue thing right here. So I showed you that before. If you want to use it in your applications, that's totally fine, but you do not have to keep using it. Really what we want to do is we just want to avoid producing errors in our application. So how do we do that? So we need to do some checks to see if the user did something wrong. And then if so, we're going to notify them. And then maybe we could do something like have them retry. I'll say maybe there, because this won't always be the case. It could be the case that the user does something that you don't want them to do, and you just say like, hey, sorry, you can't do that. But it might be the case that we're trying to get them to do something, they don't quite do it yet, and we say like very nicely, hey, you were really, really close, but we need you to try again. We need you to like fix this thing. So this is kind of like this is the overall philosophy that we want to have towards these failures and errors. Failures are going to happen. What we don't want is for those failures to become errors. And we also want to give the user a chance to fix those failures. What questions are coming up for y'all? Feeling pretty good about this? All right, let's go ahead and I will introduce this next activity. We've got a couple minutes here, and then we'll take a palm and then I'll have you all start working through it. So let me show you this lesson plan here, and we'll go up to the top. So the first thing is it says, we'll start from the many to many. This is a good place to start. But if you were, you can probably just start off of wherever you finished working this morning, off those validation branch, off the validation branch. I think that I know that one is up to date with many to many. So if you need a fresh copy, you can check out many to many, or you can just keep working from where you were. So I would say go ahead and read this intro part. This is a little bit of what we have already talked about, but I think this does a really good job of explaining this. And then you're going to get into the code here. So I'll have you all work through this together. And then I'll have you all work through this. I'll do, I don't know, I'll think about exactly how I want to put you all. But what I do want you to do is as you work through this, I would like for us to add some questions to this document. So we tried that out last week. I think it went pretty well with having you all ask questions anonymously. So I'm just going to make a section at the bottom of this document, and you can come in and you can add whatever questions come up. And I'll go ahead and turn on your write access for this. So I'll make this. Now you all can edit this. All right, let's go ahead and take a palm before we do that, and we'll come back at 1:30. me give everybody another 30 seconds to get back on. All right. So I'm going to have you all work through this on your own. And I'm not going to put you into breakout rooms for this. So I'm going to give you all until 2 o'clock to work through this, and then we'll check in and see where everybody's at. I am going to skip talking about the Flash for right now. And I think there's one other piece of this render command. So those are two things that we haven't necessarily shown you in class yet. I want you to add any questions you have on those things into this doc down here. So I'm putting you into, I'm gonna let you all work through this solo so that as questions come up, you can just like jot them down and then move on. Yeah, I would prefer you all do that, and then we'll talk about whatever questions came up as a group. So work until 2 on your own through this lesson, just starting at the testing the SAD path section. And I dropped the link to the lesson plan in your cohort channel. Does anyone have any questions on what I'm asking you to do? All right. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and turn my camera off, turn my microphone off, and I'll let you all work until 2 o'clock. If you would like to jump out of the Zoom room and then come back at 2, that's totally fine. But feel free to like come back or unmute if you run into any issues. Yeah. All right, it's 2 o'clock. I'll give everybody another minute to wrap up what you're doing, and then we'll keep going with class. Let's actually do a little bit of a little check-in before we go forward. Can I get a hand raise if you were able to make it all the way through the lesson plan? So that was up to the you do section. So if you didn't get to do everything under you do, that's okay. But if you got through adding the flash message to application.html.erb and seeing that displayed, can I get a thumbs up or a hand raise? Cool. So it looks like just about everybody was able to get that far. So I think that is perfect. I'm going to lower your hands, and I think we'll go ahead and start looking at some of these questions. And feel free to just keep adding to the doc as I go here. Okay. So the first one we have here is when you use render view, like in the example to render new after presenting a flash error message, how can you get the data the user has already entered on the form to persist, stay, and not be wiped out? So that's a good question. How do I want to do this? Let's go to, pretty sure I have this code in here. Let me just double check. No, I don't have this one here. Okay, so let's do this. Let's go to git status, check out sad. So here I'm trying to find a branch for this completed code. So I can use something that we talked about earlier in the mod, which is git branch -a. And this will list here for me all of the branches that I have, including the ones on my remotes. And I can see sad path and flash right here. So I figured there was a branch, but I didn't know what the name was. So I didn't know if it was sad paths and flashes or sad paths or sad paths and flashes, whatever. So now I should be able to take this name and check that out, git checkout. And there we go. And now I've got the completed code. So I can kind of use that to talk about this. Okay. So on to this question of, this question gets at render versus redirect and how do we get data to persist? And this kind of just brings up the question of how does data persist throughout the Rails lifecycle? So I guess the first question, the first thing to state here is, I'll kind of break this up into sub questions. So how does data persist in the application? And so I'd say there's two ways that data persists. The main way that data persists is through the database, but that's not necessarily what we're getting at right here. This is data that this is valid data that has been saved already. So that's not really what we're talking about. Really what we're talking about here is data that's kind of in transit into the database. So user fills out the form, they don't quite do it correctly, and that data hasn't quite gotten saved to the database. So how do I keep that information persistent? And I would say that the data persists through the database, and it, I guess the other thing I'll say here is sessions and cookies is another way that they persist, but we're not going to cover that right now. We will cover in mod 3. So we're not going to worry about sessions and cookies right now. So really what we're getting at here is that there's no place to store this data. We're not really storing it in a specific place. Really, the second question here, I would say this is probably more in line with what this question is asking, is how is data passed from, and I'm going to use this terminology, from request to request. So remember, under the hood, everything is about HTTP requests and responses. Our app receives an HTTP request and it sends out an HTTP response, and that's essentially its job. when you, in between each request, so in between requests, I'll say Ruby objects are garbage collected. So what that means is your Ruby objects are destroyed after you, I'll say render a view as an example. Really, this is any time you send a response, but rendering a view is a type of response that we could send. So actually, let's do this. Your Ruby objects are destroyed after you send a response, and there's two types of responses you can send. One, okay, let's say two types of responses. The first type is render a view, and the second type is redirect. So the implication here is that if you render a view or you redirect to a different page, then whatever you stored in your Ruby objects, like the objects that you've called .new on, those are completely garbage collected. Okay, some other key pieces that we're going to have to cover here. So this is like, there's a lot of background information that goes into answering this question. So how data persists, we're not going to try to persist this data. So this is not useful for this question. I'll just kind of say that. And I just want to make a distinction between when we say persist, well, we can talk about data in the database, but what we're really trying to do is get it to pass from request to request. So in between our requests, our Ruby objects are collected. Let's say, too far. Instance variables in the controller are automatically accessible in the view. So I think this is enough background information to answer this question. So if I kind of use what I just talked about and I look at this controller action here, there's a couple things to take note of. So the first thing is that we are redirecting in this case, but we are rendering in this second case here in the SAD path. In this case, we don't need, the reason why redirecting is okay here is because, so as I said, when you redirect, any objects like our @artist here are garbage collected. So @artist would be garbage collected here. This is okay to do, to redirect right here, because this is the case when the artist was successfully saved to the database. So if this artist has successfully been saved to the database, there's our persistent data right there. As we talked about earlier, the database is the key way we persist data throughout our application. So if this save was successful, we can redirect and we don't need to worry about persisting that data. But that's not what this question was asking. This question was asking, if we're trying to send that data to the form, how can we do that? Well, the first thing that you need to be careful of is that you don't want to redirect in this SAD path here. So I want to be very explicit. This else branch of logic here, this is our SAD path. So if we did something like this rather than render new, and we did redirect to /artists/new, we would get to the same form, the new form, but we would just be going about it a different way. So if we did this, based on what I said earlier, this @artist, that data that we're trying to get access to, it's garbage collected, it's gone. So you cannot use redirect to in order to populate a form with the information in progress. So I want to stick on that point for a minute. Does anybody have any questions about that, about what I just talked about and why you need to use render versus redirect here? So this is not going to work. The render new is what we want. Jacob.
I don't know specifically related, but there are times in our controllers that our instance variables wouldn't be like some sort of active record object.
Mm-hmm. Your question is, are there times?
Yeah, I
the
guess
an-
so. It's
the
not
answer would be
strictly
yes.
related back.
Yeah, the answer would be yes. There are times when you might need to set up something that's not necessarily a active record object. For instance, if we don't actually, let's go to a show, for example. Do we have a show? Let's go to a songs controller. So if for whatever reason we didn't need this song object in our view, if we didn't need like the whole, so this song.find will find me the title, the length, the play count, all of that. If I didn't need this and I just needed the ID, I could bypass finding the song from the database and just pass the song ID directly to the database, like or to the view like this. So that's an example, Jacob, of when I'm not passing an active record object. If I just needed this raw ID out of my params, I could do that. Let me undo that. Let's go to Ben.
When we like in like this create thing, if or like in another method when we do like, you know, for the index or something, when you do like maybe at art like artist equals artist.all, when you do that, like that's the instance method that, or the instance variable that you can use in the view. So in the view you could have like at artists and it would just be all of the artists. I see. Okay.
This one, in this case, at artist would be this single object
Right.
that we're trying to create. And this might be the, this is going to be, when we render this new view, we know that this artist is not valid because it triggered our sad path here.
Right.
So
I
the
see.
going from this sad path here, when we go to render this view, and let's split the screen. Let's look at artists new. So when we say render new, it's going to render this artist right here. And I think I've mentioned this before, that like form tag, if you see this anywhere, this is deprecated. So I can update this real quick to say form width. And let's give it our URL and our method of post. And then there's a couple other things I need to change here. So now I do f.label, f.text field, f.submit. I think this is a good thing to show just as like, how would I convert from a tag to a form width? That's kind of what that will look like. So when we render this new view right here, we have access to this at artist because we've set it up as an instance variable.
Right.
And that is probably why that this lesson plan had you create this at artist in the first place. Because as I talked about, when we redirect, it's gone. When we redirect back to this index page, this at artist is gone. So this at artist, so this at artist is only relevant to the sad path here.
And so then like when you're going from, you know, a form width and you click the create artist, if it's something other than new, like for instance, when we're in our projects, we're like searching for a pet. When you arrive back at the controller from clicking on the search for like search pet, it just like it tags the thing that you wanted into the params, and then you manipulate the data that way.
I'm not quite sure I followed you there.
Or like, I'm just trying to like connect the dots from like when you're going from a controller to a view, you know, creating these instance variables and stuff. That's how the data quote unquote persists, or like you can pass the data from the view or from the controller to the view. But then when you're like trying to like update or like have another action happen, I don't want to say action, or just like have something else happen from when you click on a button in the view with this, you know, the Rails form helpers, just trying to connect the dots of what that looks like then back in the controller.
So let's do this, Ben. That is what I'm like, that's my main goal right now, is for us to try to connect these dots and really follow like where is the data going. So I'd say like hold on to your question
Okay.
for another minute here, and I'm gonna keep going with this. So when we say render new here, I guess this is another. Let's go ahead and talk about. I think I just answered this, why use render new versus redirect to. Let me just talk about how this render new works real quick. So when you call the render command in a controller, we know that by default, Rails will render a view in a folder underneath app views with the same name as the controller, and the same name as with a folder, a subfolder with the name of the controller, and then a file with the name of the action. So for index, it's going to automatically look for app views artists index.html.erb. That's the default behavior of Rails. When we use the render command, it will do something very similar where it's going to infer the folder architecture or the folder layout based on the controller name. So it's still going to look under app views artists, and then whatever symbol you pass here, it's going to look for that file. So this is saying look for app views artists new. And then I guess just for completeness sake, we can also tell it to look in different folders. For instance, for whatever reason, if I needed to render the song index from this create action, I would specify that as, I think the syntax would be songs index. So you can specify something in a different folder by passing the path like that. So really, you can render any view from any action. Typically, we want to try to just let Rails default render it for us. But this is possible to do. Just want to let you all know that this is possible to do. Okay, so now that this is rendering our new, now that we know this is rendering our new view, let's see all of this in action. Let's run Rails S, and I might have to set up my database a little bit. Let's find out. Let's go local host 3000. Yeah, you're on Rails. Let's go to artists. Cool, we see our button for new artists, so we'll click this. Syntax error, I think I'm missing a comma. There we go. Okay, so I'm at my new artist form. I try to click create artist. And oh, this is, I think I also need my local true option here for my form. Let me refresh that and try again. And there we go. So I get my flash message. All of my code is working appropriately. But what we wanted was we wanted something like, let's actually double check our artist model validates name. Let me add in another validation here. So this is like kind of going back to our class earlier where we said, or what I said earlier of like, this is very much connected to our last class. So now that we know that this .save is working off of our validations, if I just add in a new validation, this should still work on the controller end. So let's see if that works. Let's go back. Let's refresh this page. And then do I already have a Prince? Okay, so now I have a Prince. Let's try it again. So now that we have that uniqueness validation, it'll say artist not required, missing required information. Okay, so we're back here. What we wanted to do is we wanted to pre-populate this field with Prince, and so that we wouldn't have to like retype it. But as we can see, that data just disappears. So let's kind of follow it through our code one more time. So I type in Prince here, I hit create artist. That's going to take me to my create action right here. So then we're going to take those artist params, which is our name that is not unique, create a new artist object from that, call .save. This fails our validation for uniqueness true. So .save returns false. So then we execute the else branch of our if else logic. We create a flash message, and then we render new. Because we've rendered this view directly from this controller action, we have access to @artist. So over here in my form, I could add something like text field. And I believe the syntax for pre-populating this field would be the name of the artist. So @artist.name, something like this. And this works because I've created an instance variable in my controller and I have rendered instead of redirected. So let's go back and see what happens. So I'm just going to type up here artist new. And we're going to get a no method error in artist new. So this is on our text field. So let's look at what's happening now. So we've got text field name at artist.name, and this is failing. Does anybody want to take a stab at why this is failing? It's saying undefined method name for nil class. So what that's telling me is that our at artist is nil. But as I just talked about, I should have at artist in my new view. So why don't I have access to that? Anybody want to take a guess? Why is this error happening? Jesus?
I think that because the first time that you're populating the new view, at that very moment it's not creating the artist. So the form already has an artist.name, but since you haven't really created that, it's just nil at the moment.
Yeah.
So you need to add some extra filtering in there.
And so Jesus, just to clarify, you're talking about right here from this new action, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the create action is totally fine. It's creating an at artist. And if we try to render the new view from there, that'll be totally fine. But that's not the only place where this view can get rendered from. It's also being rendered from this new action. So we also have to set up an artist in here. And how am I going to do that? Well, let's just create a blank one like that. So now this is a very key point that we could have the same view rendered from different controller actions. So we need to make sure that both of those controller actions or all of those controller actions set up whatever instance variables we need. So both new and create need to set up this add artist so that we don't run into that nil class error over here. So now when we refresh this form, undefined method merge for nil class at artist. What did I do wrong here? Let me look up the syntax for this. So I think my syntax is off. And this is another good thing for me to show you all how to do. Let's look at our form. So I'm gonna go to my API doc here, this one, because I'm looking more for like a specific syntax. I don't really want the guide here. And I want to see if there's an example of pre-populating a field. Let me command F for populate. I think I'm actually looking for the text field. Just looking through the examples in here. Okay, let me click on text field on the right here since it looks like form width is not giving me what I want. I'll click on text field. Okay, and this looks more like what I want. So this title gives it a class on change. Let me actually try this value. Okay, that worked. Okay, so let me just explain what I did there. When we talk about like pre-populating an HTML form, what that means is adding in a value attribute into the input type. So this was just like a little bit of my background knowledge about how HTML works. So I'll go in here to this input and I'll try to add in something like value. You probably can't see this very well. So I'm going to add in here value equals, and then let's just say like whatever. And we can see once I add that in here, that is what's added into my text field right there. So that was just like a little background HTML knowledge that I knew. I knew that I was trying to get the value attribute to change for this input. So that's what clued me into maybe I'll add a value to my input here. Okay, so I think this is working. Let's refresh one more time. We're at our new, so when I just visit this path, I'll hit enter one more time. Let's follow this. We render this, or we execute this new action. This new action creates an @artist and sets it equal to artist.new. So this is just a blank object. So when we're rendering our form, the value of @artist.name is just empty. So then we end up with this empty form. So then we go in here and we'll try to create a artist. This artist already exists. So I'll hit enter here. So when we hit enter, that triggers our create action. We create the new artist, but this time we create it with that title we entered. @artist.save produces false because in our artist model, we have validates name and we said uniqueness is true. So this fails. So we skip over this line of code and we go straight to line 19 here, create a flash message, render the new form. Because the new form has @artist.name for our value, it should take this @artist. I kind of think of this one as like half created, like we created an object, but it didn't get saved to the database. So it's like half created. We take that name out of that half created object, stick that in for the value of our input field. And so now our artist name is persisting every time we try to click this button. So that is everything together. That's how you get information to pre-populate in a field. And I'm glad that we got to do this together because we don't have another place in our class to explicitly talk about, but this gets at some really key ideas in Rails, which is when are your objects available? What happens in a render versus a redirect? What information do you have accessible at any given point? Andrew, do you have a question?
Yeah, you might have mentioned this before, but I didn't catch it. But why is the URI like the artists when you click create and it throws the error?
Yeah, let's do, that's a great question. So let's do the whole process again, but let's pay more attention to the routing this time. So I'm on my artist new page. If I inspect this page right here and I look at my form, I can see that my form, the action for a form is what is the path it's submitting to. The action for this is /artists and the method is post. Where is that coming from? Well, if we look at our form in our view, it's URL artists method post. So that's where that's coming from. So when you click create artist, let's type in Prince. When you click create artist, it's going to go to your routes file. It's going to match this up with our with line 7 right here. So it's going to take us to that create action. And if we hit the SAD path for this, we're just going to render this view. So the answer, Andrew, is that we are on our current route is whatever our form submitted to because we rendered this new view. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Let's contrast that with if we are successful. So let's just like type in some gibberish here. If we're successful, this also takes us to artists, even though we're on a different page, because if we look at our controller action, we're redirecting here. So this is again, hitting at the difference between render and redirect. Render just renders the view based on whatever page you're currently on. Redirect causes you to go to this new page. The reason why we don't see anything different in our address bar is because the path for the redirect and the path for the form are actually the same path. They're both /artists, they just have different methods. So the form has method post, this redirect will default to a method of get. All right, I've been talking for a while. I'm gonna go ahead and take a 5-minute palm. Let's, Ben, I see you have your hand up. Let's come back at, we'll call it 2:35, and then we'll take Ben's question and we'll start to answer other questions. So come back at 2:35. All right, everybody. Let's pick it back up. Ben, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. I think if I can try and not forget it. It was something to do with because we were just talking. Oh yeah, right. Can you go back to the oh yeah. So is it then as practice for us to put like in the new action, just like have at the instance equals the class dot new? Because
Yeah, that's something very common.
Like kind of leaving it empty. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so you want to do this for this exact exercise that we've just been over for like pre-populating a field. Most of the time, when we get to binding models to forms, we're going to talk about a different syntax for form width, and this is just going to play really nicely with this syntax in the new action. But I want you all to go through the process and understand what's going on with this before we go into some of that, like, I wouldn't say like shortcuts kind of stuff, but more of like syntactic, yeah, it's kind of like syntactic shortcuts. So a lot of this mod is Rails does a lot for us. We really want to make sure that we understand and take the time to try to understand what it's doing before we use some of those shortcuts. Let's go ahead and answer some more questions. I think we got some most of this here. Let's just kind of finish up with some other answers here. So I'll say the value attribute for form inputs is what determines what is inside, inside a form element. So this is a little bit easier when it comes to like text fields, but when it comes to checkboxes or select fields or other things, the value element is still important. It's just like a little bit harder to understand exactly what it does, but we don't need to go into that. So really, when you're trying to get data to persist, you need to add that value attribute to your form elements. Okay, let's talk about this next question here. Is it better to use required on form field versus presenting a flash error message, or both? I would say the answer is both. So as Jameson talked about earlier this morning, you don't want to just have front-end validations, because if someone knows how to bypass them, and Jameson showed you all how to do that very easily, then you could incorrectly save something to the database. But it's also good to have front-end validations for user experience. So I'd say ideal is both. So ideally both. And then I would say, let's also just mention required on forms would be a, quote, front-end validation. So front-end validation will give a better, I'll say, UX for user experience, and backend will be more secure. And if you all have any other like follow-up questions as I answer these, please feel free to shoot your hand up. Genevieve?
So I was just curious how you test that you're getting like fields required. It's almost like a JavaScript response that's coming back. How do you test that in RSpec?
How would you test that in RSpec? Interesting. I think I would be very literal about it. And okay, so let's, this is how I would do it. Let's just do this together. So I click on this new artist, and let's inspect the page. And we'll see that this is just like a regular input. If I try and click create artist, I don't get like any front end validation. Now let's see how that changes if I add require true here. I think that might be required. Let's just see what happens. Okay, so let's refresh the page. Now let's click create artist. Okay, now I've got my validation. By the way, this was part of what clued me into this value syntax earlier. I watched you all put required true, and I said, oh, that's an HTML attribute. Maybe I could just add the value attribute just like that. So that I didn't just like pull that out of nowhere. Okay, so now that we've got required true on there, and I look at this element, it's doing what I want it to do. So Genevieve, my strategy here is I'm kind of like not really doing TDD. I'm doing browser-driven development to see what I want to happen so that it will inform me of how to write my test. So I can see that this input now has this required equals required here. So I think what I would do here is I would go into my, so I wouldn't try to do something like check that this like pop-up thing is popping up here. I think that would be a little too difficult. I'm gonna go write code to say, do I have an input with the name of name that is required? And this kind of like hits on that testing best practices lesson in the HTML CSS. Let's go into new. I click create an artist without filling a name. Let's say, let's put it in here. And let's say it has an input validation that won't let me submit, something like that. And then I'll pry into here. I'll run my tests. Bundle exec rspec, and I just want to point it to, whoops, rspec, spec features artist new. That's where we're working. Don't want to be blinded by too much test output. Okay, so essentially what I want to do here in my test is exactly what I did over here in the browser, but just with code. So I want to find a way to select this element. So I think the way I would do that is with page.find. And I want to use a CSS selector. So I see it has an ID here. So I'm going to pass it pound name and see if that can just get that element for me. Unable to find CSS name. Oh, I think I'm not on the page. Let's visit that page. So if I did something like page.all, I would see like a syntax error. Nah, that's not quite what I wanted. Let's just exit and do that one more time. Page.find by name. There we go. Okay, so that gives me access to my Capybara node element, which is essentially a Ruby object that represents this input. So now I think what I want to do is I want to see if it has that attribute of required. So maybe can I call dot methods on this? Maybe I'm just going to take a guess and say like required private method called, interesting. Undefined method required. Can I say something like dot attributes? Okay, let me, so I'm not quite sure how to do this. So let's go to the docs here. Let's Google Capybara node elements attributes. And now I've got my documentation for my Capybara node element class. And let's see if we can find something helpful in here. Query scope instance method summary checked, click, disabled, double click, drag to, drop, hover, inspect, obscured, react, reload, right click. Text. What would dot text return? Let's see what that does. Dot text. Nothing. What about, I saw dot value was another one. Dot value returns nil. Interesting. Methods inherited from base. Find CSS. Okay, so here's another strategy that I'm going to take, CSS selectors. So I used my CSS selector, which gave me the element. What I'm going to try to do next is try to be more specific with the CSS selector to say, find me an element with this required true attribute. So let's go to my CSS selector reference, and you're getting a really good slice of like, what are all the things that, all the documentation that you're gonna need to use. So I think, here we go, this is what I want. So I wanna say attribute equals value. Okay, I think this is the syntax that I want. I can click on this and hopefully I get an example. Yeah, I get an example right there. So let me try my page.find one more time and edit my selector to say I'm looking for ID of name and then required equals required, because that is how it looked in my view, like that, required equals required. So let's see what that does. And I think looking at my view, the required was actually wrapped in quotes.
I think you're missing a
Oh,
bracket.
I'm missing something. Yeah. Bracket. There we go. Okay, and I found it. Okay, so after all that, I was able to get to that element like that. So page.find. And I think this would probably be enough, because as we just saw, if Capybara doesn't find it, then it should error out. So this is kind of getting again at the point of failure versus error. Well, if this thing is going to throw me an error like a syntax error, then this test should be good enough. So then the final thing I would do here is I would run this test and hopefully it passes. And then I want to see if I take out required true, will it fail? And there we go. Now I get unable to find CSS name required equals required like that. And just for the sake of having an expectation, I might say like expect this dot to not be nil or something like that. So just I should be able to find this element with this required attribute. So I'll try that one more time. It fails when we don't have required. Oops. Oops. Do it again. I want to undo on this page. And now when I add in required true, I should see that that passes. So I think that that's a really good process for us to go over together, because when you don't know how to write a test, there are a lot of steps you have to do to like kind of figure that out. So first of all, I want to see, can I just write the code to get it to do what I want it to do? Okay, now that I know what I want it to do, let's see, now that it's doing what I want it to do, can I see how that changes my, especially if I'm trying to test some front end code, see how that changes it, figure out how I can write a test to work with that. And I had to do like a lot of research there. And a very, very key point is I want to ensure that my test works by taking out the thing that was working, seeing that my test catches it, putting it back in, and seeing that the test says that it's good to go. I would say that this is not something that you have to implement. I would say that this is like definitely a like going above and beyond, at least for this like specific syntax that we're working through here. But what I want you all to know is like the process of writing a test that you don't know how to write. Let me do a quick time check here. So I'm gonna have to hard stop at 3. So I think we're good to keep going with some more questions. Why use render new versus redirect to? I think that that was answered by this question here of your, well, I'll just answer it again right here. Redirect to will destroy any Ruby objects you've created in the controller. Are sad paths the only time we should be using if statements in our controller? I'll just say no here. This is not the only time where you should be using if statements. I think a lot of you did this in your project your last project where you had an if statement to say something like if this parameter is present, or if so. No, there's plenty of other times we can use if statements. If statements is kind of like textbook controller logic. What does the controller do? It's kind of like the CEO of the application. It's the traffic cop. It determines what should happen. If statements are how we tell code to make decisions about what should happen. That's perfect example of controller logic. Joseph?
Yeah, at what point does, like, the larger the if statement becomes, like, at what point does that logic slide into, you know, being something that shouldn't be in there?
Yeah, there's probably no hard and fast rule of like how big should your conditional branches would be. I would say probably like 3 would be a lot. So like if you have more than 3 paths, I guess the technically correct statement would be branches in an if else statement. Yeah. Then I'll say consider refactoring. And so when I say branches, that's like every part of your if the if, else if, and the else. So when I say 3, where I got that from was those 3 words. So like if you have an if, an else if, and then an else, that's probably good enough. And then if you have like another else if in here, else if, then I would say you probably need to start thinking about different ways to refactor. I would say ideal is 2. We have 1 for the happy path, 1 for the sad path. But you might have additional else ifs if you have different sad paths. Should we refrain from using create and in most cases just new and save? I would say probably yes. I would say most of the times it's a good idea to do new save so that you can handle the sad path. So going back to our code here, we can say doing new allows us to then call save, which is going to give us our true or false to do our if else. So usually for your creation, you want some sort of sad path. I would say the same goes for the update as well. So I would want to refactor this to handle the sad path for the update. How can we render a new form calling render some other action after completing a conditional successfully filling out a previous form, etc., a previous form? So I think the first thing that I want to do here is say when we're calling render, we're not rendering some other action, we're rendering some other view. So I'm going to edit this question a little bit. If you want a different action to trigger, that is where you would use a redirect. And then we've got some more here. Can you get out of here, cursor? I can't read this. Can you show us how to pass dynamic messages to application HTML.erb and how we would iterate over that? Yes, I'm going to treat that as a separate question. How can we, let me figure out this one first. How can we render a new form calling render some other view after completing a previous form? Gotcha. Okay. So example, what if after we called this update action and we wanted to render the new form from here? So the action, or sorry, the form that corresponds with this action would be the edit form. But if just for whatever reason we wanted to render a different form, the way that I would do that is I would do render new in here. So really what this is getting at is I can render this new form from any action in the application. If we're inside this artist controller, if I just say render new, it'll know to render the artist new. But if I was in, let's say, songs controller, if I wanted to render the artist new form from over here, I could say render artists new to tell it, hey, I know we're in the songs controller, but let's render the artists views for the new HTML ERB. So that's how you would do that. And this one here says successfully filling out a previous form. So maybe it's something like, you know, we want to do something like after we create something, maybe we want to say like, we could say like, let's give another error, let's give another message, let's say success, and we could do a different message like your artist was created. If you want to edit, and then we'll, from right here, we'll send them to this form. And so rather than redirect to here, I would do redirect to artists and then put in this artist ID and then redirect them over there. But I don't need to go through all that. Can you show us how to pass dynamic messages to application HTML ERB and how we would iterate over that? I don't know if this is exactly what this is asking, but I do want to show you. I was hoping to have a volunteer go through this, but I don't think we quite have time, so I'll just show you. So I want to talk about, when we talk about those dynamic messages, we've seen those dynamic messages earlier in class today. We talked about it, but we haven't used it yet. We know that we have access to, let's pry in here, the errors object. So let's run our test, and this should trigger our sad path test. So we're into our sad path now, or else logic. Let's look at artist. I can see that it has this nil ID, so that's that invalid object. So I should be able to call, as we did earlier, .errors, and see this errors object, and then call something like full messages, like that. So what I can do, and this is what you'll see more commonly, is rather than hard coding in this error message here of artist not created, missing required information, what I can do now is I can replace this with artist.errors.full messages. And if I look at this, this will actually return to me an array, which I think what this question is getting at is like, how would we iterate over them? Well, what I want to do instead of passing this array and iterating over it is I want to convert this to a message. And I can do that with this really nice Rails helper, which is called toSentence. So if I take this, Joseph, I saw that like, oh yeah, of course, it just does it for me. And we'll see that that just like does it for us. And let's try to, yeah, I think that's good enough. And so if I look at my application layout, my application.html.erb, this one is already iterating over my messages. So if I just stick this in here, I don't need to change anything on the front end. My front end is already built to show that message. So I'll just take this out here. And now my test wouldn't pass. So let's just Rails S it and see what it looks like. Yeah, let's go back to artist new. Let's just click create artist. Oh, and it doesn't let me do that because of my front end. Okay, let's duplicate one. And it customizes that error message and it says name has already been taken. So then I would update my test to rather than test for this hard-coded message right here, I would want to test it for something like this auto-generated error message right here. And that's the end of our doc. So I think I just got through everything. So I've been talking for the last hour. I've said error a lot. I think that some very key takeaways, some points that I want you all to take away from this is, yes, sad paths are important and testing sad paths are important, but in addition to just testing for sad paths, there is a rich interaction of everything that goes into our Rails application. So there's rendering versus redirect, there's how instance variables are passed between views, there's when information is lost and when information is not lost. And that is a key learning goal of learning Rails. We can show you how to like do the just like the kind of basic stuff in Rails, but you on your own are going to have to use tools like the developer console, like this thing over here, and Prize, and looking at documentation and all of that to really like dig into how does Rails work under the hood. There's just some things that we're not going to get to show you. And so as much as I can, I want to encourage you to like break things, put Prize in places, see what happens when we take out our front end validations, put in our front end validations, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where I'll leave you all today. Please take a minute to fill out this survey for this class that's linked in our calendar event. And I do want to make a very quick note to you because I am going to have to run right now, but I didn't get a chance to talk about it. Our project signups for tomorrow and for Friday, and this says Thursday, this should be on Friday. Our project signups aren't going to quite work because there's 29 of you and there's only 2 of us. And so we just don't have enough time to get to all of you. So we're actually going to do group check-ins for this. So just be on the lookout for that. I'm going to send out a survey in probably like 45 minutes for you all to fill out. And I will be making the schedules rather than having you all sign up. So more information to come. Please be on the lookout for that. And that's it. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, thank you all.